Crime and Punishment, Fyodor Dostoyevsky, Part 1, Chapter 2, read by Connor 500. Raskolnikov was not accustomed to crowds, and, as we have already said, had been avoiding all forms of society, particularly of late. Now, however, he had a sudden longing for company. Something new seemed to be accomplishing itself within him, and one of the things that went with it was a kind of craving for people. So tired was he, after a whole month of concentrated depression and gloomy excitement, that he wanted, if only for a single moment, to get his breath back in another environment, no matter what it was, and in spite of all of the filth of his surroundings, he was now content to stay on sitting in the drinking den. The owner of the establishment was in another room, but he frequently entered the main one, coming down into it by way of some steps, whereupon the first thing one saw of him was his dandified black boots with their large red flap tops. He was wearing a long-waisted podiyovka and a hideously greasy black velvet waistcoat. He wore no cravat, and his entire face looked as though it had been lubricated with oil, like an iron lock. Behind the bar there was a boy of about 14, and there was also another younger boy, who took the drinks round when anyone ordered anything. On the bar there were sliced cucumbers, black sukari, and some cut-up pieces of fish, all of which smelt very bad. The place was suffocatingly hot, making it almost unbearable to sit there, and so saturated with the fumes of alcohol that the air on its own would have been enough to make a man drunk in 5 minutes. There are some encounters, even with people that are complete strangers to us, in which we begin to take an interest right from the very first glance, suddenly, before we have even uttered a word. This was precisely the impression made on Raskolnikov by the customer, who was sitting some distance away, and who looked like a retired civil servant. Several times later on, this young man would recall this first impression, and would even ascribe it to foreknowledge. He kept glancing at the civil servant incandescently, no doubt because the official was staring persistently at him, and seemed very anxious to get into conversation with him. At the other people in the drinking den, including the owner, however, the official cast a look that in some way seemed habited, and even bored, containing a shade of haughty disdain, as though these were people of inferior social class and education, to whom he had nothing to say. He was a man already on the other side of 50, of average height and stocky constitution, with hair that was turning grey, and a large bald patch. His face had the swollen look that comes of constant drinking, yellow, almost greenish in colour, with puffy eyelids through which his tiny slit-like eyes shone, reddish and animated. But there was something very strange about him. His gaze displayed an enthusiasm that was positively luminous, and said that there was most likely both sense and intelligence, but at the same time there was a flicker of something akin to madness. He was wearing an old and completely tattered black dress coat, which had shed all of its buttons except one. This one button was still managing to hang on somehow, and he had it fastened, evidently wishing to observe the proprieties. From under the nankeen waistcoat protruded a white dicky, all crumpled, splashed and stained. He was clean-shaven, in the manner appropriate to government officials, but it must have been a long time since his last shave, for a grey, thickish stubble had begun to appear on his features. There was in his manner, too, something that bespoke the solid, dependable air of the civil servant. He was, however, in a state of agitation. He kept ruffling his hair, and from time to time would prop his head in both hands as though in despair, placing his threadbare elbows on the splashed and sticky table. At last, He looked straight at Raskolnikov and said, loudly and firmly, "My dear sir, may I make so bold as to address you with some polite conversation? For although you are not in a condition of eminence, experience tells me you are a man of education, uninhibited to the beverage. I personally have always respected education, united with the feelings of the heart, and am, if I may so inform you so, a titular counsellor. Marmeladov, such is my name, titular counsellor. Dare I inquire whether you yourself have been working in the service?" "No, I'm studying," the young man answered, rather surprised both at the speaker's particularly flowery tone and at being spoken to in such a direct, point-blank manner. In spite of his recent momentary desire for any kind of contact with people, at the first word that was actually addressed to him, he suddenly felt his customary irritable and unpleasant sense of revulsion towards any stranger that touched, or merely attempted to touch, his personal individuality. "So you're a student, or an ex-student?" the civil servant cried. "I knew it. Experience, dear sir. Repeated experience." And he put a finger to his forehead as a token of bravado. "You've been a student or have trodden the path of learning. But if you will permit me," he rose to his feet, swayed slightly, picked up his jug and glass, and came over and sat down at the young man's table, slightly to one side of him. He was intoxicated, but he spoke voluble and with eloquence, only on occasion losing his thread slightly and slurring his speech. He pounced upon Raskolnikov avidly, as though he had not spoken to anyone for a whole month either. "My dear respected sir," he began with almost ceremonial formality, "poverty is not a sin, that is a true saying. I know that drunkenness is not a virtue either, and that's an even truer saying. But destitution, dear sir, destitution, that is a sin. When a man is poor, he may still preserve the nobility of his inborn feelings, but when he's destitute, he never ever can. If a man's destitute, he isn't even driven out with a stick. He's swept out of human society with a broom, to make it as insulting as possible, and that is as it should be. For I will admit when I'm destitute, I'll be the first to insult myself. Hence the beverage. Dear sir, a month ago Mr. Dostoyevsky gave my lady wife a most unmerciful beating. And that's not quite the same as if he'd given it to me now, is it? Do you take my meaning, sir? Permit me to ask you another question, sir. Have you ever spent the night on the Neva, on the hay barges?" "No, I haven't had occasion to," Raskolnikov replied. "What are you driving at?" "Well, sir, that's where I've just came from. This night will be the 5th I've spent there." He poured himself another glass, drunk it, and paused for reflection. The odd wisp of hay could indeed be seen sticking to his clothes. There were even some in his hair. It looked highly probable that for 5 days he had neither undressed nor washed. His hands in particular were filthy, red and oleaginous, with black fingernails. His conversation seemed to be arousing general, though indolent, attention. The boys behind the bar had begun to snigger. The owner, it appeared, had come down from his upstairs room especially in order to listen to this funny man, and had sat down some distance away, yawning languidly but with an air of importance. It was evident that Marmeladov had been long a familiar figure here. Indeed, he had probably acquired his penchant for flowery rhetoric as a consequence of being used to frequent boozy conversations with strangers of various types. This habit becomes a necessity with some drinkers, particularly those who are given rough treatment at home, and whose lives are made a misery. It is for this reason that in the company of other drinkers they invariably seem to be doing all they can to justify themselves, and if possible even to gain respect. "Hey, funny man," the owner said loudly, "why don't you do any work? Why don't you do any serving, if you're a civil servant?" "You ask why I'm not currently engaged in the service, dear sir," Marmeladov answered quickly, addressing himself exclusively to Raskolnikov, as though it was the latter that asked the question. "You ask me that? Do you think my reptilian existence doesn't make my heart weep? A month ago, when Mr. Lebeziatnikov unmercifully beat my lady wife and I simply lay there drunk, do you not think I suffered? Permit me to inquire, young man, whether you have ever had occasion to, ask for some money when the situation is hopeless?" "Yes, I have. But what do you mean when it's hopeless?" "What I mean, sir, is when it's completely hopeless, when you know beforehand that nothing will come of it. For example, you know in advance with absolute certainty that this man, this most well-intentioned and thoroughly useful citizen, will of no account lend you any money at all. For why, I ask you? For why should he? I mean, he knows I won't pay it back. Out of compassion? But only the other day, Mr. Lebeziatnikov, who follows the latest ideas, was explaining that the science of our day had actually declared compassion a social evil, and that this notion is already being put into practice in England, where they have political economy. Why, I ask you, should he lend me anything, and yet knowing beforehand that he won't? You nonetheless set off down the high road and... "But why go to him?" Raskolnikov said. "But if there is no one, if there is nowhere left to go, I mean everyone must at least have somewhere left to go. For there comes a time in every man's life when he must simply have somewhere to go. When my only daughter went on to the yellow card for the first time, I went there too, for my daughter lives on the yellow card, sir," he added in paralysis, looking at the young man with a certain uneasiness. "No matter, my dear sir, no matter," he hastened to add, evidently quite unruffled, as though both of the boys snorted with laughter, and even the owner smiled. "No matter. Such wagging of heads does not confound me, for it is well known to everyone already, and that what was hid is now revealed. Indeed, my attitude to all that is now not once of contempt, but of resignation. So be it, so be it. Behold the man. Permit me to ask you, young man, whether you can. But no, I must put it more strongly, more figuratively. Not can you, but dare you, as you look upon me in this hour, say beyond all shadow of a doubt that I am not a swine?" The young man said not a word in reply.